Good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. A warm welcome to this British-Kazakh Society Education Group event. Today's event is about the role of institutional autonomy and academic freedom. It'll be moderated by my old friend Montu Saxena from the University of Cambridge, and our keynote speaker, I'm delighted to say, is Dr. Maya Chanksiliani from Oxford University. So two of the world's top universities present today. A little bit about the British-Kazakh Society before we start. We were founded in 2002 to promote the best of relations between the United Kingdom and Kazakhstan to enhance our bilateral relationship. We also place great emphasis on establishing and maintaining cultural and educational exchanges between our two countries. And our Education Committee has the objective of facilitating that communication and networking for our members and interested parties in the post-secondary school education systems in Kazakhstan and the United Kingdom. Already, we're using our networks to partner UK universities' expertise with that in Kazakhstan. The webinar today is in Russian and English. At the bottom of your screen on the right, the little globe icon, you'll see if you press on that, you've got the interpretation link. And on the Q&A button, please send in your questions during the event, and Montu and Maya will work on those after Maya has given her presentation. So over to you, Montu.
Thank you, David. We are very delighted and honored to have our speaker with us today, Dr. or rather I should say Professor Maya Chanksiliani. She has an excellent sort of footing in this particular kind of dialogue between Kazakhstan and UK in the realm of education. As a way of introduction, I should say that her CV has already been advertised, and you can find a lot about her. She's a very well-known scholar in this education sphere at higher education level, and she was a high flyer already at a young stage in Georgia, leading to her master's study in Harvard, and eventually coming to us in Cambridge. And we had pleasure of having her as a colleague and friend for a number of years while she completed her doctorate. And already then she was engaged with working with Kazakh students, and her journey in this area started. And we're very proud to see her as established a faculty member in Oxford Education Department and an important figure within the UK academic scene. And she'll be tackling a topic today which is multifaceted and in fact extremely critical. We talk about energy security, climate change, food, terrorism, and so on. But at the end of it, it's the citizenry which matters, and what values they have and what role universities play in shaping that. And in the post-Soviet space, this is even more interesting because in a sense we can study its evolution more directly, because it's in that transformation, the idea that how you move from Academy of Sciences structures to a university setting, and then we loosely use the word Western style university. What does that actually mean? There are many questions which people and the planners within that sphere are trying to engage with. And today's talk kind of starts that discussion in a more specific ways. And we hope we can take that further regionally and with our involvement further with the education group here. So I'd like to hand over to Maya for today's proceedings. Thank you, Maya.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Montu, for your kind introduction. And thank you, everyone joining already. People are joining. I see some Kazakh names as well as Georgian names, which is quite nice, because this is a study including two cases. I will try to share my slides. I hope you see my slides now. Great. So This is a study on university contributions to societal development. This was designed as a study on university contributions to societal development in Kazakhstan and in Georgia, two former Soviet countries. And some of the emerging findings are quite interesting as they relate to institutional autonomy and academic freedom. So I will try to take the next half an hour or so to share some of the findings of this study, which are also published already in the journal Higher Education, and the publication is open access, so anyone can read it if you are interested. This specific study was co-authored by two academics from Kazakhstan, Iqbal John Koraboev from Kazgu University and Dilbar Gimranova from Narcos University. This presentation will also include a few ideas and few pieces of evidence that emerged from another study that I did during the pandemic, because the original study was done pre-pandemic. Another study that I did during the pandemic to feed into the monograph that I'm currently completing. And the monograph title is What Happened to the Soviet University, and it covers all former Soviet countries. And as part of that monograph project, I also collected data which relates to institutional autonomy and academic freedom. So I'll share some of those findings as well. So the two countries, Kazakhstan and Georgia, everyone present here probably knows where the countries are, knows differences there that exist in terms of demographics, in terms of economic and social development, more or less. I will not dwell on that at the moment. I will try to tell you a little bit about their higher education as a kind of contextual grounding for the talk. You see on the left-hand side corner, gross enrollment ratios. So these are proportions of individuals going to university in these countries, and you see where they stand in relation to other countries in their sub-region. So you see that Georgia and Kazakhstan are both leaders in terms of very high participation rates in higher education within their sub-region. So lots of young people choose to go to university. And they have capacity at universities to educate very large proportions of young people. Another interesting aspect is the research productivity that you see on the right hand corner below on the slide. This comes from another analysis that we did with colleagues at Higher School of Economics. And you can see in terms of the numbers of papers that are produced by authors based at institutions in these countries, in terms of impact of these papers, there are differences between these two countries. So Georgia and Kazakhstan produce almost similar numbers of papers, slightly more in Kazakhstan, but in terms of impact, Georgian papers seem to be much higher impact. And in both of these countries, there have been significant reforms in transforming universities, and universities now do a large share of research produced in these countries rather than research institutes. Another interesting final point about higher education systems is that in both of these countries, higher education institution landscape is extremely diverse. There are institutions of different sizes, different missions, private and public. So both of these countries have diverse landscapes of higher education institutions. Now, for most part of the 20th century, higher education in both of these countries was molded to follow the Soviet model of university, which was oriented on a clear fit between the output of higher education and the manpower needs of their economies. In the last 3 decades, these societies underwent dramatic transformations in terms of societal, economic, political, cultural development. Education has been both a driver and a reflection of these transformations, and it has been central to policy discussions associated with market-oriented globalization and Europeanization, particularly so in Georgia. Both of these countries are part of the Bologna process, European higher education area. Now, the purpose of this study, original study, which was conducted right before the pandemic, was to understand how academics in these two countries see the ways in which universities can support local, national, and global development. So there is a coinage, well-known coinage in higher education literature, GLONACO, which brings together local, national, and global. Okay, so we wanted to understand how universities, academics see the challenges that their societies are facing and how universities can address those challenges. Okay, now, of course, there was one way of approaching this study, and some of you who do social research know about the challenges of designing instruments, I suppose, and how we do research. One way of approaching this would have been to take SDGs, you see in the right-hand corner of the slide, take SDGs and just ask academics whether they see this as challenges facing their societies, global society, and how and in what ways their universities contribute to achieving the sustainable development goals. There is quite a lot of literature, actually, this kind of literature pertaining to different parts of the world. What we did was slightly different because we wanted to do a slightly kind of more bottom-up approach to give more agency to academics, participant academics, to define what they thought were local, national, and global challenges, rather than taking SDGs at face value. Okay, so by doing that, we also kind of underscore the main assumption underpinning this study, which is agent-oriented view of development. So individuals, institutions, as well as nation states are viewed in this study as agents of development rather than patients. So we reject, to a certain extent, a deficit lens, a patient lens that underpins a very large portion of international development literature, including education literature. And we try to see how academics see themselves as agents of development, as well as institutions and nation states. And freedom is a central concept when we talk about agency. Okay, therefore, we talk a little bit about freedoms, different kinds of freedoms in the publication, and I will just give you a little bit of flavor of that. So first of all, the freedom that we give to academics to define what are their societal challenges, okay, and then to tell us how universities are addressing those challenges and how they see the support that they need in the future to address those challenges even more effectively. Okay. On the other hand, freedom emerged in the study itself as positive freedom and as negative freedom. So negative freedom is quite interesting because negative freedom is all about freedom from interference. As you will see, academics report about the interference, especially from the government in their university business quite actively, which limits their freedom. So that is one part of negative freedom, which is not surprising because those countries have limited traditions of personal, political, and academic freedoms. On the other hand, negative freedoms are linked with positive freedoms in this study when academics talk about their choices, how they can exercise their agency, how they view purposes of education in very different ways from how they think their universities view purposes of education. So that's quite interesting as well. Agency freedom, how they see they can contribute to their societies and how they can exercise their agency. And finally, the freedom to imagine the role of education in a slightly different way from how we see the role of education in main government reports, in main international development agency reports, and in the overwhelming evidence on the discourses in this country. So below here, you see two approaches to understanding development, perhaps, and understanding also the role of education to the societal development. This conceptualization is developed in this paper for the first time. It's quite original conceptualization to a certain extent. So on the one hand, we talk about essentialist understanding of societal development and essentialist understanding of education's contribution to societal development. Why essentialist? When we take a certain property of the phenomenon as essential, for example, when we talk about human capital development as the central aspect of societal development, or when we talk about the need of modernization of values in society. On the other hand, there are lots of non-essentialist approaches, and some of the evidence from this study shows that actually academics do see and do imagine education and the role of education in non-essentialist terms, thinking about holistic development of individuals, thinking about individuals as citizens of the country, as people who will change things in their societies for better, and people who need to make decisions about their own futures themselves, need to have choices and need to have capabilities to exercise those choices when they talk about students as well as when they talk about themselves. So non-essentialist approaches to development and education's role to development is very much oriented on freedom of choice and freedom of deciding what people value in their life, rather than necessarily focusing on what someone else sees as the required needs for the labor market and the alignment of universities with the labor market as it used to be in the Soviet economy, when everything, all of that was planned and everyone knew what was needed and how the pipeline of university to labor market worked. Okay, very briefly, I wanted to share this. Now let's see how our participants saw the main challenges. Probably for most of you who are listening to this talk, none of this will be really unfamiliar. So probably all of this is quite familiar. There was a lot of evidence on participants seeing that there was a shortage of competitive workforce in their countries, that there was some unemployment, especially in Georgia. There was also a lot of migration, especially from Kazakhstan, which respondents found quite problematic. Poverty emerged as a very serious challenge in Georgia, but less so in Kazakhstan. Productivity in both countries, and economic development, overall economic development of the country in both countries was an issue, and in Kazakhstan particularly it was related to industries that are not natural resource driven. Now let me read one of the quotes from Georgian respondents, which is now slightly non-essentialist. Okay, education system, respondent notes, does not create the environment for individual self-realization. So not only competitive workforce, but self-realization, which is much more holistic understanding of individuals' development based on their talents, interests, and skills. Particularly problematic were scarce public financing for education in both contexts, lack of good teachers, limited development of critical thinking, insufficient use of teaching approaches, they thought, and limited autonomy of universities was mentioned by several respondents in both countries. Finally, corruption was overwhelmingly present in Kazakhstani responses, and nepotism was overwhelmingly present in Georgian responses. And one of the respondents also noted that it's a national disease. Interestingly, more respondents from Georgia than Kazakhstan were concerned with slow democratic transition of the country and slow formation of civic society. When it came to global challenges, you can see on the right hand of the slide some of the things respondents mentioned. Very interestingly, when we did the analysis, we tried to compare respondents' views with the SDGs. And interestingly, we see that in all the responses, we had around 17 survey responses, very detailed responses, which is really wonderful that academics took so much time. Some of the SDGs are not there at all. For example, gender equality does not emerge at all as an issue, water and sanitation, sustainable energy, And very interestingly, access to justice does not emerge here at all. Now, interesting question that we asked at the start was, what was the purpose of higher education? Okay, and we gave to academics 5 options. We asked these questions 3 times. So first we asked, what do you think are the main purpose of higher education? Rank it from most important to least important. Next question was, how do you think your institution sees, leadership of your institution sees the purposes? And then how do you think your students see the purposes? Very interestingly, when we asked academics about themselves, how they see the purposes, the overwhelming majority chose the 3rd answer, okay? Overwhelming majority of academics in both countries saw higher education as time and space for individuals to learn new things and to discover who an individual is and what they want to become, okay? Now, this was very different from what academics thought their institutional leadership thought about the main purpose of higher education and their students. So the first option, stepping stone for individuals' employment or further studies, was most popular option when academics tried to tell us what their institutional view of higher education was and what their students' view was. Okay, so we see a clear divergence between academics as they report about the main purpose of higher education and their views of what their institution and their students think. I will not go into great detail about other options. The one thing I will tell you is that basic research for advancing scientific knowledge was the least important purpose across all groups as academics saw it, which was quite sad, to be honest. Okay, so applied research was quite valued in all responses, but basic research less so. Now, academics identified the main challenges and then told us how they see their contributions through education, research, and engagement functions. Okay, so these 3 domains. And I will try to very quickly go through some of these responses. You see all the details, very tiny text here. I will not read that text, but I will tell you that academics framed their university's educational mission and how their university contributes to societal development through education, largely in human capital terms. They talked how they prepare teachers, doctors, engineers, scientists to contribute to those sectors, okay? To the joint national labor market and contribute to those sectors. Now, selected respondents also spoke about the contribution of AG to the holistic development of individuals, bringing up active citizens who participate in peaceful protests, who challenge status quo and bring more healthy and equitable societies, promoting moral values, develop individuals' understanding of the world and society and the world around them, and so on and so forth. There were quite a few notes on how much academics could contribute to their educational provision of what they taught and how they taught in order to achieve all of this. And there were quite a few concerns emerging that academics in both countries had limited possibilities of actually changing their curricula, changing things that they taught, because all of that was quite strictly controlled through quality assurance mechanisms and through the procedures that universities and national governments put in place. So they saw very little possibilities of actively changing the educational content and delivery, which is quite interesting. And they referred to this as academic freedom. So they referred to alignment of curricula with labor market needs, because they thought they wanted to make changes to curricula in order to align it better to labor market needs, and they saw limited possibilities of this. And they they refer to this as academic freedom. From my monograph project evidence, I see the same, which is quite interesting. And also, they referred to the choices between online and hybrid and face-to-face delivery also as academic freedom, that academics need to have to choose those modes of delivery, which is also another interesting aspect. So relatively less on the overall kind of academic broader freedom of inquiry and expression within academia, but more about day-to-day changes that they can make, which they feel they cannot exercise that kind of freedom. And in the future, they hope to have more freedom to further modernize curricula, to further modernize things, to bring them closer to international standards, as they saw international standards, so that they could not only change what they taught, but also contribute to developing of corruption-free communities and find solutions to economic and political problems, very interestingly. Academics also taught about different models of higher education institutions that currently do not exist in either of the Georgian academics taught about the importance of perhaps thinking about community college model, the US community college model, to bring universities closer to societal development problems. And Kazakh academics mentioned an open university model that could actually be quite useful in Kazakh society to align the needs of economy with educational provision, which I thought were quite interesting. When it comes to research, I'm also looking at the time. When it comes to research, as you can see on this slide, many more Georgian respondents gave their views about how their research contributes to societal development rather than Kazakh respondents. Again, overwhelming majority of responses were about applied research. So respondents differentiated very clearly between applied research and basic research. I suppose this may come from the Soviet tradition again, this kind of very strict differentiation, because I do not think we encounter that very strict differentiation, for example, in the British context, to really separate things that are applied projects and then entirely basic projects. We do not differentiate it that much in Britain, perhaps because it's very difficult to differentiate, and very often blue skies research that academics would call basic research, I suppose, can lead to very important applications. Montu and others probably can talk much more about this. So this differentiation, I thought, was not quite effective to a certain extent. Now, very interestingly, the main assumption underpinning all responses was that research is scientific, okay? Research is scientific versus political or moral, okay? So that was a very clear view of academics, and that research reveals objective truth. There was very limited evidence to hypothesize that the respondents had considered the critical or radical science as they shared their thought about contributions of research to society. And aligned to this view of the importance of applied research that seeks the truth and seeks scientific resolutions and scientific establishment of scientific truth, aligned with this was the idea that universities need specific research support to develop capacity. And all of that narrative was largely embedded with a neoliberal understanding of capacity that must be measured through inputs and outputs and publications and impact factor, etc. Very interestingly, Georgian academics were arguing that they need more assessment of research, very similar to what Kazakhstan already has introduced across universities, very strict and very clear assessment of research output. So that was quite interesting to a certain extent. Now, all academics across all surveys demonstrated engagement with other actors, okay? Engagement with global community. Perhaps people who responded to this survey are generally more engaged, and therefore it's not surprising. Engagement with international communities, engagement with businesses within their countries, engagement with civil society sometimes, and so on and so forth. So we had an impression that there was really vibrant academic engagement going on and exchanges going on in both countries. Interestingly, academics thought that in order to support further engagement and more effective engagement of their universities with all of these actors, and also becoming more entrepreneurial, becoming more oriented on business needs, and being more free to establish those contacts without any interference from higher up, they needed more democratic structures of governance. So it was quite interesting that they justified these more democratic structures of governance with the idea that they needed more freedom to engage better with all the actors that they have been engaging with. And this is the final part of my talk. Probably I'll take another 5 minutes or so. So governance, interference, and all of these things were emerging through the responses quite a bit. Let me tell you, before I present some evidence and explain things further, let me just present to you very simply, because not everyone is an educationalist here, that there are 3 recognized models of university governance in literature. The literature starting from the 80s to date. There exists an idea that we can have a state-centered model of governance. So characteristics of state-centered model would be strict control of university admissions requirements, curricula, assessment, selection of academic personnel, as well as university-industry relations. With very limited autonomy of universities, where key people in the university administration are often appointed, sometimes elected, but those elections are quite dubious because they are normally favorites of the party who is in government. This model is underpinned by the assumption that universities are instruments to achieve national strategic priorities. Soviet university was a great example of state-centered model, but not only Soviet. For example, Turkish, Romanian systems are also quite state-centered, as well as Hungarian system, especially in the last few years. Then there is a market-oriented model where university is a business enterprise that uses entrepreneurial tactics to attract its customers, students, and to sell its product, which is education and research. University is in constant competition with other universities as it's financially dependent on its customers and donors, okay? It controls the quality of its product through its own mechanisms. So it does not depend on government quality assurance mechanisms to control its products. It does it on its own and competes with others, okay? And this model, market-oriented, is characterized by a mistrust between the state, universities, and society. American university model is a great example of this. And then we have the Humboldtian self-governance model, which is all about self-governing community of scholars, okay, which rests on the assumptions of the freedom of teaching and learning, free scholarly inquiry, and the unity of teaching and research, okay. Academic self-governance is the foundation of this model. It involves weak management of university and entirely collegiate control. It has a lack of comprehensive performance-based criteria pertaining to teaching, student selection, or pay scales, and so on and so forth. So Humboldtian self-governance is basically what you would imagine when you talk about ivory tower or Republic of Science notions, okay? Now, universities in Kazakhstan and Georgia are founded still on the principle of one-man management, which is the most widespread approach to university governance across the higher education sectors in both countries. The majority of universities remain state-centered, sometimes government-run institutions. most often government-run institutions. At the top of most university governance structures is a heavy-handed, powerful rector who is often closely connected with the ruling party. The state-centered model of university governance has seen little change, unfortunately, in these countries. At the same time, the attributes, several attributes of market-oriented model are creeping into both of these systems and starting to blend with the state-centered model. Unfortunately, very few signs of Humboldtian academic self-governance are present at the moment in these systems. So it's largely state-centered with some signs of market orientation. And one of the fundamental problems of HE in this region more broadly, which is lack of critical analysis, critical discourses, and meaning making in governance, as well as in teaching and research, sadly does not seem to have seen much disruption. A theme emerging in many responses was that universities needed more freedom from external government interference and more democratic structures of internal governance. Now, I will give you a moment to read these two quotes about what they need. A quote from a Georgian respondent and a quote from a Kazakh respondent. And note that the Georgian respondent mentions granting. I really think this word is very important. So even when we talk about freedom and autonomy, it seems that the expectation is that this will be granted to universities. And this is quite an interesting word, I think, to see in light of agency, right? So expectation that this will be granted. Very rarely, if we look at the history of mankind, are freedoms granted. Freedoms are normally actually fought for, okay? Many participants of this study craved for an environment free from excessive regulatory burden and supportive of their real academic freedom and institutional autonomy, an environment where academics would teach what they judged was most appropriate, whether, irrespective of whether that was driven by the need to align things better with labor market or whether it was because they thought these changes would support delivering a more holistic curriculum. They also talked about freedom from interference from the government in terms of quality assurance mechanisms, in terms of strict regulations, how the curricula should work, how their teaching outlines, reading lists should work, and so on and so forth. They also mentioned overwhelming use, quote, of the Soviet patterns of management and interaction. And one of the Kazakh academics argued that the governance structures in their university and elsewhere required radical changes. And we finished this study by arguing that in order to be effective in supporting low-knuckle development, global, national, and local development, perhaps universities need to practice their freedoms and resist being exclusively tied to the immediate interests of the nation state. Perhaps universities need to educate individuals following high standards, not only in a narrow human capital understanding, but more holistically as it emerged from a number of interviews, developing humanistic values in critically thinking, environmentally friendly and politically active citizens. Therefore, perhaps our subsequent discussions need to start with considering what our core expectations are when it comes to universities' developmental mission, and what conditions would be conducive to achieving these expectations. Based on our deliberations as part of this study, a holistic approach to university contributions to low-knuckle development would encompass essentialist outcomes as well as anti-essentialist imaginaries. And the foundational condition for this holistic approach would be for the agents, for individuals, for universities, as well as nation states, to nurture freedoms, to promote, to support freedoms, positive freedoms, agency freedom, as well as freedom to imagine better future and how it can be achieved. Thank you very much. I have a kind of reference to the article, which you may want to read, as well as some other references, which will be all, I hope, posted on the webpage. Okay.
Thank you, Maya. Excellent presentation and a lot of questions. And as is with any good research, it opens more questions than it answers. That's what we see here. We already have some questions, but I just want to make a couple of quick comments reflecting on some of the things that you said. One important, I think, in terms of data and methodology issue is that when we look at post-Soviet space, particularly Kazakhstan and Georgia, if we are polling university academics, we have to refer back to the history that you pointed out, that their role historically had been different. Their understanding of what is research and why they are there is very different from an academic, say here. And the tension that lies with Academy of Sciences, where the research and knowledge production was done in a particular way. So some kind of a narrowing down to what they think about applied versus basic research is going to be necessarily different because of who they are and systematically how they've evolved and how they react to the demand of what they should do with research and their own sort of capability of engaging with that demand are all sort of underlying threads which we need to kind of systematically understand. And that leads to the inverse point out here. I would contend actually the opposite, that there is an equally sharp divide between applied and basic research in the West. The way it is mitigated is different because we don't have that Academy of Sciences and university divide. So we are restricted by funding for research, which is largely put up to 93% or so of the national budget in applied areas. So the way it's mitigated is that the basic scientists imply that their research is applied, but what they do is blue skies. And so it's a very different mitigating. In US, in Germany, here, it's the same thing that we have to do. So, I mean, as you know, it's impossible almost to find deaggregated budgets for R&D, for basic versus applied and so on. So you can't really measure it properly. So it's very good that that question is being raised, and we have to ask why that is happening. So I'll stop there. And this is not for you to respond. We have a question from the floor. Anita, is there any way she can be heard? Alijan?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you, Anita. Go ahead. Yes.
Thank you, Professor, so much for the interesting lecture. I myself am from Georgia as well, as you can probably tell from my last name. And I have a question that maybe goes a little bit beyond your research. However, I would be very interested to hear about your opinion on this as you're an expert in education. I was wondering, how do you think knowledge production patterns, especially in the field of social sciences in Georgia, play into the, let's say, non-ideologically charged political polarization in the country? So, I mean, there are many political parties in Georgia. There's a severe polarization in the political arena, but ideologically, all the major parties are, in practice, center-right and right. So how do you think academics in Georgia contributes to the state of affairs? Would you say that maybe education itself helps perpetuate the mainstream neoliberal narratives in the country and not really leaving space for conceiving of alternative ideologies and development models that political parties could take up and champion in the country? Thank you.
Oh, that's a really great question. That is a really wonderful question. I'm trying to, actually, I was writing about something very similar at the moment. And at the moment, actually designing the project is almost approved project funding to study social science knowledge production in Georgian universities. And luckily, one of the biggest foundations in Georgia has given quite a bit of money. We are now signing a contract at Oxford with them to study that exact point, how social science knowledge is produced at Georgian universities. So we will know much more about it. Now, to go in slightly in depth into this. who are the academics at the moment who do social science in Georgia? That would be a starting point. Social sciences did not exist as such in the Soviet Union. For example, in education, it was largely about teacher training, pedagogy. It was not the research, type of research that I presented to you now, which is social scientific, right? So there was very little sociology, there was very little research in economics, and in sociology, in anthropology, geography, very different type of research. So nowadays, social scientists working at Georgian universities are mostly relatively young people. Many of them have studied social sciences outside Georgia, outside the former Soviet space. And many of them see things, everything that comes from the Soviet practice, everything that is from the past, from the large part of the 20th century, with some skepticism, I suppose. First, because social sciences did not exist in those days, obviously. And second, because I think there is a real overwhelming influence of this neoliberal right-wing ideology, unfortunately. But this does not apply to everyone. I am so sorry, I forgot the name of this association of academics. Actually, I recently gave an interview to them. There is a very strong association of academics in Georgia, bringing together social scientists from different universities, which actually promotes socially oriented research. What people from the right-wing camp would call perhaps socialism, but which is very different from socialism as those people from the right-wing camp understand it. Okay, socially oriented research that is focusing on expanding equal access to education, for example, equality of pay for individuals in different sectors, labor rights, for example, and so on and so forth. Things that are basically linked very closely to human rights. So it's very far from communism. It's all about human rights and equality of individuals. And there is this association of academics. I will try to find the name now. Sorry that I forgot the name. So there are some people doing such research, but as you mentioned, unfortunately, there is an overwhelming focus on competition, on assessments, on different neoliberal values, voucher financing, and all of that. And those neoliberal ideas are promoted very actively, including this survey, where lots of Georgian respondents say that we can increase research capacity only by introducing big national assessment systems to assess research output. This is quite surprising that people would ask for such a system, whereas everywhere else where such system exists, overwhelming majority of academics are arguing that it does not work and does not bring any benefit. Sorry, I will stop now because I know there will be other questions coming in.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Maya. There's a question in Q&A, and then there's one in the chat. The Q&A, I don't know if Kevin would like to ask verbally, but we can read it and you can. So Kevin Hunt asks, how do you feel the system of university governance in Kazakhstan affects their ability to collaborate with the other universities worldwide, which may operate differently?
Oh, this is an excellent question. Thank you. So, well, I can give you lots of examples. Now, from my own experience and practice as well, besides research. One of the key challenges, I think, of doing research with universities in Georgia and Kazakhstan, especially with Kazakhstan, because somehow I think I work much more with universities in Kazakhstan than in Georgia, surprisingly, because actually universities in Kazakhstan are much more proactive. From my own experience in social science, I work in education, so I cannot tell you about other areas, but universities in Kazakhstan are very active. They always try to get in touch, to do things together, different events, sometimes research projects. Now, I think one way that things could slightly change for better collaborative practices is to have more academics reaching out proactively rather than administrators. So at the moment, people who reach out to establish collaborations, or if I reach out to establish collaborations, it's that academic from Oxford, for example, needs to talk with an administrator in Kazakhstan university. So such links are largely established by people who are in administrative posts, for example, head of international office or dean of a school, or people in those posts. So that is quite rare elsewhere and very tricky for us, because when we want to build links in research, we want to talk to other academics to discuss those ideas, to see why those ideas may be interesting, important from the academic perspective, as well as for in terms of applicability, right, in the sector. For example, if we discuss a research project that will improve methods of teaching, that's quite an applied research, or if we discuss a research project about employability of graduates, quite applied, but we need to talk about it with an academic who does the similar work, rather than with an administrator who wants to kind of put a memorandum of understanding on their page, or has some other goals of publicizing this. So I think I am much more interested in academic output, in academic ideas, and would much prefer to talk with academics. Lots of times when I am approached and I'm asked to join a research project, it has failed and never materialized because I had no opportunity to talk with an academic. So I could not really understand how research project would work by me sitting here as an academic and administrator in Kazakhstan. So it needs to be a collaboration between academics. And sometimes that happens, like our study, which was a collaboration. Iqbal and Dilbar both are academics in Kazakhstan. Actually, they work in different social science fields. One of them is international relations and another more in business field. So it was a lovely interdisciplinary collaboration because we were driven. We met at a conference and we wanted to do something together. So that's a much better approach than administrators getting in touch with academics and trying to start things that way.
Thank you, Maya. And I think I will add that one of the motivations behind us here in this committee and formation of this committee is to help translate those. There's no fundamental problem between different systems working together. The question is understanding how relationships are built and how content is built and how they synergize with each other. It requires sometimes work, and the kind of MOU driven, as you put it, Maya, approach often doesn't take things forward in a UK setting easily, because there is no content and no one can be ordered to now fulfill the aims of MOU. It must come organically through intellectual partnership, as Maya just described. So this is where, but it's not a fundamental problem. It's just that we need to recognize it and just work together. So I believe we have a question in chat, but before that, David Hardy had a question. So David, please.
Thank you, Montu. Thank you very much indeed, Maya. Fascinating stuff. And my question briefly is about the purpose of a university, which came out in your presentation. And as you know, in this country, in the UK, and in many other countries, there's been a push over the last 20 or 30 years to make institutions which had formerly focused on local economic development, on technical education and training, to make them into universities. And I just wonder if that's really gone too far, if a way forward isn't to identify different types of higher education institutions, some which focus more on basic research, some on more of the, you might call it utilitarian stuff, linking directly to the needs of local business or national business.
Good question, David. Thank you so much. I would argue that institutions themselves need to decide those things. And if they decide to be entirely applied, like developmental university model, you know, quite popular in some African countries, in Latin America, entirely focused on the needs of the communities, even the research entirely driven by, for example, agriculture, research the needs of communities, medical issues within the community, etc., veterinary and stuff. So if universities decide to pursue that, they need to be able to do that. It cannot be the government deciding that in this region we need this type of universities and now you need to transform into this, and in other region elsewhere different types. I think what I did not have much time to go in further detail, but I can say now that in both countries, Kazakhstan and Georgia, they have done so many things to change their higher education sectors. Probably it cannot even be compared with other countries in their sub-regions. They have done enormous amount of things, including in terms of university autonomy. So if you compare on paper how university autonomy is defined and all the legislative parts in Georgia and Kazakhstan, they are far ahead when compared to other countries within their sub-regions. But it's not really fully implemented yet. So really understanding that universities can be given much more freedom to determine what their purposes can be, should be, deciding that, then securing resources from diverse sources, including government, but other sources too, because they are engaged with diverse collaborations, diverse activities with international and local organizations, etc., and deciding for themselves rather than someone else deciding on their behalf, someone else who is in a minister's seat today, and then tomorrow it will be a different person, and so on and so forth. So I agree with you, but it needs to be decided by the institutions.
Thank you very much indeed, Maya.
Thank you. There's a question in chat by Edward Miklatse. I'll just read it out just for the recording's sake. What methods can be used to synchronize the higher education system and labor market in developing countries where the human outcome of higher education system is high, but it is not correlated with the labor market, which experience labor shortages and unemployment? It's a very big question with many different kind of answers we can give. But Maya.
I think Montu and I like this question very much. We have had this question many times by now, and I know Montu also has lovely examples. And if I may, I can start with Montu's example. That I think it's correct that Montu says that 40% of history graduates at Cambridge, is that correct, Montu? 40, I think, right? 40% of history graduates at Cambridge University find a job in the city. History graduates, okay? So why do I start with this? Unless you have a centrally planned economy, like the Soviet economy, I'm not aware of any other one, maybe in North Korea or somewhere else, a similar economy, or in Turkmenistan or somewhere else, but I do not know. Unless you have a centrally planned economy where you control exactly all industries, that all industries are state industries, and you can plan how many people you will need in each industry, and you can plan how many people universities will accept in each course, there is no way of aligning labor market with higher education. So that is in itself not possible, okay? In developing countries, as you call, like economically less developed contexts, they are economically less developed, and it means that labor market structures are very weak, okay? Employment levels are very low because, not only because universities may not be aligned with labor market, which they are not anywhere else, including Cambridge University or Oxford University, but because also there are no jobs for these people, okay? Therefore, this question in itself, I would say, is quite problematic. So it's not universities' fault that some of the graduates cannot find employment. This problem is quite complex in countries where there are weak labor market structures. The university's job is to educate individuals holistically, to prepare them for future learning, workplace learning, individual learning, because all of us, if you observe individuals who are successful what they do, you will see that they might have changed several times what they do. They have continued learning throughout their career. So it's not really a pipeline. So that linear human capital model of a pipeline where university has some inputs and uses those inputs to produce graduates who are employable, that is a myth that does not exist in the world. That does not happen. There is no such national or higher education system where that happens successfully. So successful universities educate individuals holistically, not only specifically for a specific job that is out there. That happens as well, of course, but it's much broader, much more anti-essentialist, what I explained, because that idea itself of a production line is quite misleading. That's why there is so much frustration in Georgia and Kazakhstan, in higher education systems, at ministries, at universities, that they're trying to chase something that cannot really be achieved. Sorry, I know David does not agree with this.
I don't think David disagrees with it. It's a question of what degree of what we include.
Yeah.
I just want.
What you just, it opens up some fabulous routes that really do need to be explored, in my experience, by most governments, because you know, centrally planned. Well, there are elements of the British system that are very centrally planned. If you look at doctors and nurses and central, you know, the National Health Service, so you can easily analyze, does that work compared with other countries which have a different approach? And I think those international comparisons are often rather illuminating, and we can learn from that, whilst not, you know, I think it's often difficult to transpose models from one country to another because of cultural differences and so on. But I think the funding mechanism is something that is utterly fundamental in all of this. When the United Kingdom pushed for more people, more school leavers to go to university, suddenly you have a great inflow. And your figure about the Cambridge graduates and so on in the city, I think the Chartered Institute of Personnel Development have just produced some figures that show something like 40% of university graduates in the UK don't do a job that you need a degree for now. You know, this is a talk for another time, isn't it? But it's what a university is for, and I certainly do agree with you that more should be left to individual institutions, which requires, in my view, an entrepreneurial approach by the management of the institutions. Entrepreneurship not in setting up a business, but in effectively running what is, you know, and many, certainly the vice chancellors and the former polytechnic directors who became vice chancellors see themselves, I believe, as chief executives of major institutions. And so how you run that is very different from a, you know, a centrally funded operation. Lots to talk about there.
Well, in terms of central planning thing, one of the very interesting observations, and it's in fact how misunderstood it is. So even within the Soviet system, the Academy of Sciences did not come under central planning. It was actually allowed a separate stream of budgeting rather than, because it could not be. It could not be, but how did the system realize that it could not be is the puzzle we need to understand. How were they able to have this almost Humboldtian model, which was accepted by others who were not, you know,
so far that they would not do anything that was critical to the system? Or...
Well, this is again the interesting thing is that most critical people, including Sakharov, came out of Academy of Sciences.
That is true. There are exceptions.
Well, quite strongly. I mean, there are very few who were of that power, and he was not alone. I mean, he could be there. And then you had Landau, you had Kapitsa, you had all kind of people who did not stand to scrutiny and managed to still work. But then again, I'm pushing back on my own field because physics was able to do this, and I would equally give in to and agree with you that the biology wasn't able to do that. It was politically enslaved
It
by
was
the
destroyed, yes.
yeah. So
physics, well, the explanation is that physicists were so successful in certain period that they kind of deserved that status of having slightly more freedom, considering that physicists could not do anything really to destroy the structure of the Soviet ideology or anything like that.
well,
But
they could leak the bomb secrets to others.
Well, I tell you, one of the things I found very early on, back in '93, I think, when I was invited to Moscow by the Russian Academy of Sciences, and there was a danger as time moved on, and I found this even in the Baltic states, that some of the academics felt they'd gone too far in throwing out the old Soviet system and trying to embrace whatever the Western system might be described as. And you mentioned the Bologna process. And I think this is, again, to my mind, points to the need for individual institutions to think these things through. You know, where do you want to go? Not at the behest of short-termism from education ministers who are supplying most of the funding to most institutions, which de facto becomes a bit more like a centrally planned operation.
I think we are coming to the time where both Maya and the audience has to leave. And my last kind of a comment regarding, because we are British-Kazakh Society and we have discussed global issues with a peppering of Georgian experience, to reflect, as Maya said already, the Kazakh so diversity and in a sense activity, energy of the system is very, very high. And I'd like to leave our audience and this in this recording forever that we need to engage from our side more. There's from UK side, either there is an impetus to sell services or engage in terms of student recruitment and so on. But I think we need a lot more effort and mechanisms and funding mechanisms to work with academics in Kazakhstan. And I would like to kind of push that forward. I think that's a common belief amongst us, and I hope we can build on that as we go forward. David, over to you to finish today.
Well, thank you very much indeed, Montu, and very many thanks to you, Maya, for an excellent and thoughtful talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and it does promote and prompt lots more questions, and maybe we can run another series of webinars on those. Our next event, date still to be decided, will be from Dr. Miljana Radivojevic of the University College London. And that will be about the early development of the Silk Roads, very apposite given the China's current Belt and Road Initiative and the impact of that, not only on Central Asia, but through into Europe. So we look forward very much to that. Keep an eye open and we'll send you details of the date as soon as we can. But thank you very much indeed for joining us. And given the nature of today's discussion, if you've any thoughts on relations between Kazakh and UK universities, please do send them in to us, to Maya, to Montu, to myself. We'd welcome that. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Goodbye for now. Good luck.